Joining me now is Manal Omar, who's with the U.S. Institute of Peace. She's also the Associate Vice President for the Middle East and Africa Center. But I think even more importantly, she's the author of Barefoot in Baghdad, which chronicled your time there in Iraq from 2003 to 2005.
That's right.
You worked with widows in that country. And as we see these images coming, obviously there's a lot more widows, a lot more young children growing up without their fathers. Talk to me about the reality of war, its tentacles, how it ripples across society, and what you saw while you were there.
I think one of the biggest challenges that you see in Iraq is people continue to wait for the aftermath. When is the post-conflict phase actually hit? And what's happening is that the conflict continues to kind of peak and then go down, and then it continues to find another way of manifesting as we see today. So women tend to really bear the brunt of war, and particularly women with young children. You have a whole new movement of internally displaced people from the north, and then you also have a huge movement of refugees trying to flee the area. And again, the women are the ones who are the primary people who have to bear this responsibility.
So a decade ago you were there. Today you see these images, you see what's happening. Walk us through the last 10 years. So what went wrong? When do they get to that post-aftermath?
It's a very difficult, question in terms of trying to understand what went wrong. I was there in 2003, lived there until 2005, and I go there every quarter. I was just there 3 weeks ago, and it's very difficult to pinpoint what exactly was the area because each 2 years, Iraq is almost a different time and place. I mean, the Iraq of 2003 is completely different than Iraq of 2006, where you first had the initial insurgency, which then resulted in the surge, and that was known in Iraq as the Dark Ages. 2008, I would say up until a year ago, people really thought they were in the post-conflict phase. I mean, you didn't have the democracy that people imagined, but you had progress, and you had people beginning to imagine that things could be different. I think about a year ago, the primary change that triggered this rise is both a lack of inclusivity, particularly of the Sunnis, but also a reality that we're not talking about Iraq alone. We're talking about regional dynamics, primarily the Syria conflict that overwhelmed the situation in Iraq. And the U.S. Institute of Peace has been saying this for over a year. You no longer have corridors in the border. You now have a fully open border, arms, people, everything going in between. And, it was almost able to predict the situation that we have today.
So having just come back from there, what are the people there saying? I mean, what do they see as the pathway to stability?
It's very different depending on the area you're in. So if you travel to the north to the Kurdish regional government, there is a sense of there's no way that they can work with southern central Iraq, and there's a very strong thirst for an independence, not necessarily just from a self-determination standpoint, but from a realistic standpoint because of security, because of the problems. And in the north, it's almost like any other country in the region. There's more stability, there's more economic prosperity. If you travel to the western provinces, which is primarily the Sunni areas, there's a lot of frustration, marginalization. They feel that they're targeted by the central government. They're not necessarily supporting ISIS and the extremists. I think that's something that's very dangerous, is to assume that all the Sunnis are part of the extremists, but they also feel frustrated because there is no way to be part of the political process, in their opinion. If you travel to the south, there actually is a strong base for Maliki, and I think that's another missing part of the equation, is that people have looked at Maliki as an individual, not necessarily recognizing that he represents a viewpoint in Iraq and a viewpoint that has come out to vote and support him. So getting rid of Maliki isn't as simple as people would like to imagine, because there is a base for him that feels wronged and feels that if you take them out, then their voice is now discounted and marginalized. So what really needs to happen is some way of bringing in a national government that people really believe will fulfill their commitments.
How do they view engagement when Secretary of State Kerry comes, when leaders come from other parts of the world and say, hey, here's the recipe, having been given so many recipes along the last decade or so? Well, how do they see it?
I think that you said the right thing in terms of they want to believe it, but there's little faith because they followed some of the prescriptions that were assigned before. I think that there is an interest in international players, mainly because there's a lack of trust between the different political systems. So you need a national dialogue in Iraq to be able to form a real national unity government, and you need a neutral party that's not from within Iraq to play that role. Ideally, it would be the UN, but there isn't a lot of faith in the UN, so it might have to be the UN alongside with the US and other international players.
You see the drones coming from Iran, the United States. You see all what's going on the ground politically, as well as the fighting. Worst case scenario, best case scenario, as you look at the dynamics.
Well, I mean, best case scenario is that this is a lesson for all the political parties that the situation in the region will easily overwhelm Iraq, and for there to be, a real focus in terms of what's best for Iraq in terms of a national reconciliation, national dialogue that leads to a unity government. I think that is a real possibility if international community plays a role. Worst case scenario is that we're seeing just the preparatory work for a real strong sectarian violence that would not only be limited to Iraq, but would pull in Syria and possibly the rest of the region. I think that is also a very strong possibility for where we are now. It's very hard to predict which way it'll go. Right now, it's literally everything is in the air, and we're in a position of having to see where things can fall. The ideal situation is that the international community uses whatever influence it has on each of the different political parties to force that national reconciliation.
But best case scenario, it's got to be stitched together pretty quickly because this thing can spiral out of control rather quickly, don't you think?
Yes, you have, it's almost like you've let a gas leak out and it's just waiting for that one spark that could lead to a huge explosion. So timing is of the essence, but that's something that we've been saying for over a year. It's that tension, that fuel that's in the air has been there, and that spark could happen at any moment in time. We still haven't seen the worst. I mean, that spark hasn't happened yet, and people are restraining themselves.
Well, Manal, thank you so much for coming in, offering your insights. You're just back from there, so we certainly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.